This week, it's time to catch up on the shenanigans of Israeli politics. A few months ago, it seemed like longtime Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu would lose his position after the third round of national elections in just under a year. But now he's back on top. So let's dive into what happened and what comes next. I'm Lev Gringaus, and welcome to The Jews Are Tired, your podcast about Jewish news. So, if you want a full refresher on how Israeli politics have been over the past year or so, feel free to go back and listen to some earlier episodes of this podcast. But for now, I'm just going to give the big picture view on what's been happening. Israeli politics have always been a mess, a product of having a parliamentary system where, out of the 120-seat Knesset, a political party or coalition of parties has to have 61 seats or more to form a government. And with every party in a coalition trying to shove their often conflicting agendas into the government, political fights all too easily lead to the dissolution of the governing coalition and then national elections. Now, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has been in his position for a little over a decade because he and his political party, the right-wing Likud, have usually been the biggest at around 30 or so Knesset seats and able to gather a stable-ish majority coalition of parties in the Knesset over the course of several elections. But Netanyahu's success seemed to be running out over this past year. In national elections beginning in April of 2019, Netanyahu and Likud were challenged by Blue and White, a new political party that was really a conglomerate of several parties, led by three former heads of the Israeli Defense Forces and a prominent former TV journalist who is now in politics full-time. Blue and White's head honcho and candidate for prime minister was former Israeli Chief of Staff Benny Gantz. And let me just give you a quote from Gantz to kick off the explanation of why he was running against Netanyahu. In 2019, in an interview with the Times of Israel, Gantz said, quote, "We are speaking about a corrupt man who is destroying the country," end quote. Now, destroying the country is an accusation with questionable merit, depending on the perspective, but accusing Netanyahu of corruption is rooted in reality. Netanyahu has been indicted but not convicted in 3 corruption cases that the Israeli Attorney General was investigating him for, with the most prominent indictment being for the charge of bribery. The last Israeli prime minister who was investigated for bribery, Ehud Olmert, stepped down in 2008 at the urging of politicians across the political spectrum, including then-member of the Knesset, Benjamin Netanyahu. But now Netanyahu has no intention of stepping down and is Israel's first sitting prime minister to be indicted in corruption cases. This then rolls into the long list of criticisms that Gantz and Blue and White ran on. Netanyahu's alleged corruption, Netanyahu's erosion of public trust in Israel's justice system as he calls his indictments a leftist coup, Netanyahu's government coalitions with religious ultra-Orthodox parties that force their version of Judaism onto the Israeli public, Netanyahu's gutting of the foreign ministry, and Netanyahu's lack of clear policy regarding the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, among many, many other issues. And look, I'm not just talking about this for the fun of mudslinging at Netanyahu. In April of 2019, Israel held national elections that resulted in neither Netanyahu or Gantz being able to form a governing coalition in the Knesset. With no government, Israel held more elections in September of 2019, which again resulted in no government. So Israel went to another election, the third national election in under a year in March 2020. And again, it seemed like Israel would have no government and was better off scheduling another election. But then the COVID-19 pandemic swept the world. And Netanyahu proved why he's, in some situations, really quite great as prime minister. Netanyahu threatened his own Likud party and told them that there would be a disaster unless Israel was placed on lockdown. And he did it. He locked down Israel, stopped all flights, organized quarantine measures and widespread testing, and got Mossad, Israel's intelligence agency, to find medical equipment. Now, none of these measures were perfect, and much of Israel's success fighting COVID-19 has to do with the high-quality healthcare system, but in a crisis, in March and April, the image of Netanyahu, the confident leader, did wonders for his public image and political capital. As a side note, Israel, a country of roughly 9 million people, has had around 17,000 confirmed COVID-19 cases and only around 280 deaths over the past few months. And now Netanyahu is lifting restrictions and reopening Israel, but weirdly, no one can explain why the number of cases or deaths hasn't been that high overall, or haven't gone up since reopening began. Some local outbreaks are still happening, but generally speaking, they're under control. Regardless, even if Netanyahu's strict measures during the pandemic aren't absolutely the thing that helped Israel get by relatively unscathed, it's his image that made all the difference. Because after all that Gantz had said about Netanyahu, and after swearing never to serve in a government with the prime minister he called corrupt, Gantz fell in line. Israel, during a pandemic without a proper functional government, was not something he wanted to see, and Netanyahu was calling him to set aside differences for the good of the country. So Gantz broke up blue and white, took his group of Knesset members and joined Netanyahu to create a governing coalition formed out of the COVID-19 emergency. Notice how Netanyahu, brilliant political operative that he is, stood firm, and Gantz was the one who had to set political differences aside for the sake of the country. And as the coalition agreement came together, most any political analyst or journalist agrees that Gantz pretty much got screwed. Technically, there's a rotation where Netanyahu will be prime minister for 18 months, and then Gantz will step in and become prime minister for the 18 months after that. But no one thinks Netanyahu will stick to that agreement, so Gantz is unlikely to be prime minister. But hey, at least now there's a government with 73 Knesset members. So what happens now? Well, there are a couple of challenges on the horizon, which I'll just sum up as briefly as I can because they'll likely be topics for future podcast episodes. Number one, just because the COVID-19 death and case numbers are low now doesn't mean that the virus can't reemerge again, particularly if Israel is reopened too quickly. And as the awe of Netanyahu, the pandemic savior, wears off, it's clearer to the Israeli public that the Israeli government is still very dysfunctional in its response to the pandemic. The economy also needs a lot of work, as over 1 million people in Israel have already lost their jobs due to the country's lockdown, and if COVID-19 hits again and another lockdown becomes necessary, even more could lose their jobs. Number two, in January, the Trump administration revealed the next generation of American peace plans for the Middle East and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The main feature of this plan was giving the green light for Israel to annex up to 30% of the West Bank, while the other 70% would be slated to become a future Palestinian state. Well, Netanyahu now says, after years of promising and not doing so in the past, that in July he will go ahead and have Israel annex some part, if not all, of that 30% of the West Bank. Now, if we're to judge by official diplomatic channels, this will be a political catastrophe for Israel. European countries are warning against it. Arab countries are warning against it. And who knows how much Israel could be ostracized or even have sanctions enforced against it. Except, for all the noise, there's likely not going to be much of a consequence if Israel does move forward with annexation. Israel is a regional powerhouse of technology and of crucial intelligence gathering that has helped other countries stop countless terror attacks. And I'll be honest with my view here, I don't think anyone is going to cut off ties with Israel, and even if there's a war of words, diplomatic spats die down. The world has enough on its hands with the pandemic and the economic effects of the pandemic and all the other issues, like the global refugee crisis that existed before COVID-19. Israel will be hurt, however, with many American Jews, who generally are against Israeli annexation in the West Bank. How they might respond, though, and how much American Jewish institutional support for Israel would actually be jeopardized is a whole other issue for another podcast episode. If Israel decides to annex, it will also damage its always shaky relationship with the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, which could be a serious national security issue. The PA, for all of its faults, helps Israel all the time to stop terror attacks. But if Israel decides to annex part of the West Bank and protests start up, the Palestinian Authority may choose to let the West Bank get violent. Like American Jews, this is another big what if. And despite my thinking that no country will actually cut off ties with Israel over annexation, there's a lot of mixed signals coming out of the Arab world. When Trump moved the American embassy in Israel from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, lots of analysts predicted that Arab countries would find a way to respond. In hindsight, it was like they didn't even care, and nothing happened. But annexation may be a step too far in the politics of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and what consequences Israel would actually face? Another big what if. Arab countries, whether openly or secretly, have strong ties to Israel, particularly when it comes to cooperation between intelligence agencies and facing off against Iran, a common regional enemy. Would they give that up? I really don't know. Which brings us to number 3. Iran continues to be a regional threat to Israel. In fact, a few weeks ago, Iran launched a cyber attack on some of Israel's water infrastructure, signaling that even during the pandemic, it's not about to go anywhere. Hezbollah, the Iranian proxy terror organization, is also still in Lebanon ready to attack Israel, so that remains a constant concern. Finally, number 4 on the list of things for Israel to worry about now that it has a government, being stuck between the United States and China. Both are global superpowers, both have strong ties to Israel, and now the United States is pressuring Israel to cut off key relationships with China and Chinese companies. This is part of the broader political conflict between the US and China that has emerged as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. But it could have lasting ramifications for Israel, as in 2019, a story in the Jerusalem Report had Israeli officials estimating that Chinese companies were involved in almost $15 billion in Israeli contracts and projects. Maybe overshadowing all of this for Netanyahu, though, is his trial for corruption charges, which had its first hearing earlier this week on Sunday. The next hearing will be in mid-July, so this will be a drawn-out process. But no matter what, for now, the longest-serving Israeli prime minister in history, Benjamin Netanyahu, still sits on his throne. This has been this week's The Jews Are Tired podcast. I'm Lev Gringaus. Don't forget to subscribe and share, and hopefully next week the Jews will get some rest. The Jews Are Tired is a product of Jewfolk Inc. For more information, go to tcjewfolk.com or email the show at podcast@tcjewfolk.com.